So at what age do children have a say in a custody arrangement in Michigan? So you're getting divorced, or maybe you're never married, going your separate ways on a custody issue, and you have kids. And you think that there's some disagreements here. You're not going to reach an agreement between the two of you necessarily on what that arrangement should be, what the custody and parenting time arrangement is going to look like. And you're wondering, well, what kind of say do my kids have in this whole equation here? Is a judge, if it got to a point where it's a contested hearing and a judge is going to tell you when you see your kids, which of course isn't happen, it's not pleasant, but it does happen. How does that look? What kind of impact does that have? Is a judge going to talk to the kids? Are they going to consider what a child says about who they want to live with and what they want the custody and parenting time arrangement to look like? And so the answer is they definitely can. It can get to that point. So then the question becomes, at what age will a judge do that? Well, obviously, when they're 18, they're an adult. So now we're kind of out of the world completely. An 18-year-old isn't going to have a custody dispute going on because they're not a minor anymore. They're an adult. At least that's the way Michigan does it. So you're talking about children somewhere between birth and 17, and you can rule out, the younger years, of course, because they're not going to have any appreciable opinion about it at a certain age. So you're really talking about someone who's maybe 7 years old at the least, maybe a little younger in real extreme situations, all the way to 17. So you're talking about this kind of 10 years of a child's life. By the time they're 6 or 7, all the way up to 17, because of course 18, they're an adult. What does that look like? And Michigan isn't going to let a child just decide who they want to live with, but it's something to be considered. The reasonable preference of the child, that's what they call it, reasonable preference, can be a factor. So, when you're looking at deciding a custody case and even parenting time disputes, you're looking at what are known as best interest of the child factors. There's these 12 different factors that a court is supposed to be considering when they're deciding what to do with custody and parenting time between two parents who do not agree on what should happen. So, they're looking at things like, as far as a child and their preferences, they might have a preference of which parent they want to live with because who's closer to their school or who's closer to their friends or their activities. And those things aren't really reasons necessarily in and of themselves as to why someone should have custody or maybe even a change of custody. The child might have some thoughts about parenting style. Maybe one parent is stricter than the other, or one parent might even be, spanking them or into some sort of what sounds more like physical abuse or entering the world of physical abuse. So then a child doesn't like that and doesn't want to have to live with that parent. Maybe one parent lets them use a cell phone, another one doesn't. Things like that, those things can certainly be a factor, but those are not necessarily reasonable preferences. Those just might be something that a child has feelings about or emotional things about, or maybe they don't like the people that live at the other house. Maybe there's other siblings, stepkids, and a new mom, a new dad, whatever it might be. But these reasonable preferences of a child are one of the 12 factors. These 12 factors there's in this list of these 12 different factors, there's these sort of more positive kind of things. Which parent has a closer relationship with the child, of course, is one of the factors, and they all blend together a little bit. But there's a list of factors out of these 12 best interest of the child factors, some of which are positive, and some of which get into more kind of negative. The positive being who can provide for the child, who has a home for them, what the bedroom's like, what's the school district like, what's the arrangements like, who's home and who's away, and what do those things all look like. And then there can be negative factors like mental or physical health challenges that one of the parents might be having, or things like that. So there's these lists of positive sort of things that you would think of what affects how well a child is thriving and how well they're doing in a certain environment. And then there's things that can have a negative impact on that. So the courts look at those things, and then one of the factors is this reasonable preference of the child, and that all comes into play because the reason that a child wants to live with a specific parent might in and of itself not be that significant, but why they feel that way could definitely get into some significant kind of things that a court can consider. I mean, obviously, if you work out an agreement. Nobody wants a court telling them when they're going to see their child, but of course, sometimes you have no choice. You think that there's a reason to change the current custody arrangement, Because first of all, a court's going to look at what's the established custodial environment, what's the routine in place of what you're doing now. If you're married and living together and getting divorced, then the routine in place is the child has had both parents around, and then you got to look at a lot of other things. But if you're already separated and there's been kind of a routine that you've established of what you follow of when you have the child and when the mom has the child, whether that was by agreement or not, that can be some evidence as to what's appropriate here and what the court should be doing. They have to look at that, basically what's called an established custodial environment, which is a routine in place of who has the child and when they have them and how that looks and what the schedule is and what that's built around. Is it built around, when one parent works and the other one doesn't? But yeah, in general, that's what you're looking at. And then the court or friend of the court, which is part of the court system, can do an investigation. I mean, if there's really a dispute over who's going to get custody or what the custody and parenting time arrangement is going to look like, because keep in mind in Michigan custody, there's two different categories to custody. First of all, there's legal custody and physical custody. So legal custody is decision making. So normally you would share that. That would be the goal anyways. You'd want joint legal custody because you would want to say in decision making, major decisions in the child's life, like schooling, medical, religion, whatever it might be. But then really what we're talking about here in this video is physical custody, which then goes hand in hand with the parenting time schedule. So the physical custody arrangement and the parenting time are all built around the schedule. When do you have the child? When does the mom have the child? If there's already a schedule in place and you've been doing this routine for some amount of time, that can be something that's significant. It's important to keep that going if we can. Status quo is, makes a difference. We want a child to have a routine and have something they can count on and know what the schedule is going to be. So if it would make sense to keep the same schedule going, that's certainly something that the court should be considering. But if these are just two parents going their separate ways and nobody's ever had to decide custody and decide these parenting time arrangements and all that sort of stuff, then you're kind of starting from scratch, so to speak, and then it's anybody's game. You're going to have an arrangement that's based on a lot of different things, including reasonable preference of the child. Is a court going to interview your child to talk to them about custody and parenting time? Probably not. I mean, it's pretty unlikely. It's a worst case scenario. Nobody wants to put kids into these things with the legal system and decisions and judges and social workers in front of the court and that whole world. But it's possible. The law says that they will talk to the child, talk to them about their reasonable preferences if it's necessary. But typically your custody parenting time arrangement is going to mean you're really looking at how many nights do you have with the child. So most people have a rotating schedule that they build it around, rotating week 1 and week 2. Week 1's with mom, week 2's with dad. So the week 2 with dad might just be every other weekend. Maybe that's all you have, maybe that's all you want. If all you have is every other weekend, that gives you 2 nights out of 14, because there's 14 nights in 2 weeks, right? So if all you have is every other weekend, Friday to Sunday, you have 2 nights out of 14. If you're going to do every other week, now you have 7 nights out of 14. So the answer, typically the dispute is going to be somewhere between 2 nights and 7 nights out of 14 is what most people are discussing, trying to figure out and trying to get answers to. And then of course how that schedule's applied or what holidays look like and time off from school in summer. Those are all other kind of things that come into play, of course. But your typical schedule, let's say it's during the school year, you have a child that's a school age, you're looking at how many nights do I have out of 14? I'm probably not going to have less than 2 nights out of 14 because that's every other weekend. I'm not going to have more than 7, which is half. If you're talking about a child that's not school age, depends on how young they are. If you got a 3 or 4-year-old, that works out pretty well because they're really not tied to a school schedule. They might have daycare or something, but it's not school. It might be preschool. If they're not tied to a schedule, opens a door for a lot of time with each parent. You can do half the time or a shared custody arrangement or whatever might make sense. But if you have a school-age child, now you're kind of tied to that school schedule. They're going to be living with one of the parents probably during the week and with the other parent on the off times. But even an every other weekend schedule could be more than Friday to Sunday. You could have Friday to Monday, and that gives you 3 nights out of 14. And when you're thinking about the idea that 7 out of 14 is half the time, if you just went from 2 nights to 3 nights out of 14, that's a pretty big difference. If you're doing 3 nights out of 14 and you have 2 nights on the second week, that gives you 5 out of 14. 5 out of 14 is a shared custody, shared parenting time schedule. So that's some idea here. And how you get to that point is a lot of different things and a lot of things to consider, but reasonable preference of the child is certainly one factor. Now, at what age are they looking at? Well, teenagers is certainly a good answer. Under 18, of course, but older than 6 or 7 for them to have some sort of say in it. Obviously, the older the better. The older the child is and they're still not 18, the more likely that their preferences are going to be considered. The last thing you want to do is put a teenager, give them a schedule they don't want, then everybody's miserable. If there's things going on and they don't want to be at dad's house very much, it's going to make everybody miserable, making them be at dad's house all the time. Or if they don't want to be at mom's house, same thing. It's going to cause problems if they're a teenager. They're old. Once they get old enough to drive, you start losing control over the situation. They can be gone a lot. They're working. They have friends. They have extracurricular activities, whatever it might be. So the answer of when a court would consider the reasonable preference of a child, at what age that child should be, the older the better is the answer. Of course, teenagers is something to consider. You start getting under 12, I think it's less relevant, less important. You start getting under 6 or 7, and it's not even going to really be a factor. But there's no laws that say an exact age. The only age that Michigan takes a position on and has laws about is 18, because once you're 18, you're an adult. So hopefully that helps.